omnipotent presence.
Okay, well, it is 5:30, so if you want to hit record, Callie. Okay, hello everybody. Good evening and welcome to History Happy Hour, a glazed history of donuts. My name is Brianna Durkin and I am the Specialist of Education here at the Indiana Historical Society. It's great to see so many of you guys here tonight with your beverages and maybe your donuts too. This happy hour is brought to you with support from One America Financial Partners, a national provider in the insurance and financial services marketplace. This event is also supported by Jack's Donuts, who have been feeding Indianapolis for 3 generations. A big thank you to West Market Street for sending us some themed snacks for tonight's happy hour. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions upon millions of paper-based materials, books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, maps, and anything you can think of, and then finding interesting and exciting ways to share it, whether that be through publications, exhibitions, or even events like this. It is these pieces that tell the fun, diverse, and sometimes unconventional stories of Indiana, and we're excited to bring you one piece of those today. Before I introduce Callie McCune, our moderator for tonight, I have a few logistics to cover for our event. For this event, Paul and Callie will converse for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have a question at the end or as we are going along, please drop it in the question and answer section. We'll keep an eye on them, and then we'll ask your questions during the Q&A section in the second half of the program. You've all been muted tonight, but we do want to hear your thoughts. Add comments to the chat box as we go. Also keep an eye on it for links and URLs. Don't worry if you miss one. The links will also be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. We also want to let you know that this program is being recorded. You can catch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, in the upcoming weeks. If you enjoy this program, please consider coming back for more. Join us next week for our History Happy Hour on July 30th, covering Asian activism from 1960s to today. We also have more History Happy Hours coming your way very soon, looking at the Equal Rights Amendment, suffrage, and another brief history of underwear, so keep an eye out. Learn more or sign up for any of our History Happy Hours at indianahistory.org and discover our other virtual offerings coming soon to an internet-connected device near you. Without further ado, please let me introduce you to Callie McCune, Manager of Public Programs at the Indiana Historical Society, to get us started.
Hi everyone and good evening. I'm really excited to be coming to you tonight to talk about donuts. They're one of my passions of food. I am excited to have one here to maybe eat as we go along tonight. And I hope y'all have some donuts to munch on as we get going tonight. But let me first start by introducing Paul Mullins, who will be our scholar. Paul is a historical archaeologist who studies consumer cultures of the last half millennium. This can include research on material consumption and the color line, contemporary material culture and dark history, and its relationship between popular culture and materiality in the contemporary world. There's a lot of different places you can catch Paul's work. He's written books. He's written books like Community Memory and he's written books like Race and Affluence and Archaeology of African America and Archaeology of Consumer Culture. He is also one of the co-authors with Dr. Sue Hyatt on Invisible Indianapolis, Race and Heritage and Community Memory in the Circle City, which if you want to dive into parts of Indianapolis's history that we don't talk about, that is a really great place to get started. I love diving deep into what they talk about. Paul is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at IUPUI and a docent of American Historical Archaeology at the University of Oulu. I said that wrong again, didn't I? Can you help me, Paul?
Oulu.
Oulu, there we go, in Finland, and is the past president of the Society of Historical Archaeology. So welcome, Paul. Thanks for coming to talk to us about donuts.
Thanks for having me, Callie.
And what I didn't mention is that the reason we asked Paul to be here today is because he wrote this book called Glazed America, A History of Donuts, which he told me as we were getting started that was a summer project for him. So I'm hoping that I can have a summer project to write a history on food someday. But we're going to talk a little bit about donuts and how they fit into American culture. And as we get started, as we're here in a happy hour, we usually start with, what are you drinking tonight? But I think maybe we'll start with a little bit of a fierce debate about what you're eating tonight. In IHS, a couple of weeks ago, this fierce debate broke out over all staff emails about where the best donuts were in Indiana. So I'm gonna ask Paul what his favorite donut is, whether that's Longs or Jack's. Thanks, Jack's, for giving us donuts tonight. Rise and Roll, we call them crack donuts with the caramel on top. Taylor's. So feel free to put your favorite donuts in the chat, but Paul, where do you go for a donut if you want one in Indy?
Those are all, we could go to lots of different places in town and get an exceptional donut. I'm probably not I don't necessarily favor any given donut. Jack's makes really fabulous donuts. I sort of like Longs, to be honest. I like a Longs yeast donut. I'm from the South, so I sort of favor sweet donuts. But as an anthropologist, I think part of my research has always started from the perspective that you don't try to talk people out of their experiences. Somebody may like Great American, somebody may like Taylor's, somebody may be a Jack's fan, somebody may be religiously devoted to Longs. Those are all perfectly good possibilities. So I'm always interested in why they favor those particular places. And it's not just about the pastry. You know, part of it is about the place and the donut and the shop and their connection to the shop. I do like Longs quite a lot.
We were talking before we started, and there is something about a Longs donut that melts in your mouth, and is fresh and warm. But for me, it's any warm glazed donut that melts in my mouth. I'm a goner for. But let's start a little bit with defining our terms. So what is a donut and what isn't a donut? And how did you decide that when you were writing your book?
Yeah, well, that's a little bit in the eyes of the beholder. Certainly in America, usually you and I probably think of the circular torus-shaped fried flour with a hole in the middle. And that's a donut, really. You're holding a donut. But every bakery has a variety of other fried pastries that may or may not have a hole in the middle, and they may or may not have a name, or they may have a name in one region that they don't use in another. So they could be a bear claw in one place or a fritter. They're all basically fried flour, but usually that circular donut is in the US, is what we've called a donut since the late 19th, early 20th century.
And does it have to have a hole in it, or how do you decide can it be?
I think it usually has to have a hole in it. However, there are plenty of shops where you don't see that hole in the middle.
Gotcha. I was going to say, I've had this debate recently about bagels. Is it a bagel if it doesn't have a hole? So I feel like that could be this continuous debate about donuts too. What got you inspired to dig into donuts as a part of American consumer culture?
Well, I'm a historical archaeologist, so I'm interested in the materiality of the last 500 years or thereabouts, and I'm particularly interested in really 20th century material culture and contemporary material culture. And all archaeology is about is contextualizing objects. You know, how do we tell stories? How do we spin a narrative around a material thing? And donuts can be used to tell really, really rich narratives. And the thing I liked actually when I began to think about it is maybe being a scholarly subject is that there was nobody on the fence about donuts. You might hate them, you might love them, but there was nobody in between. There are very few things in our life that have that clarity. You know, spam maybe. You know, there are very few things like that where we either hate them or love them, and we have probably a strong, articulate, conscious sense of how we feel about those things. So I knew there'd be a kind of rich discussion about what donuts meant. And that's really what I wanted to get to, is how do people make sense of themselves and their world and project it onto a particular material thing, in this case, donuts.
Or sometimes maybe the place you buy the donuts too.
You cannot separate the pastry from the place.
Right.
If you already, when you began to talk about longs, you started talking about Hawville, 16th Street. You think about the shops themselves, the people who work in them. And every donut family would say that about each of the Jacks. We would say that if we were talking about Taylor's. It's always, it's not just objectively the pastry alone.
I also think there's something around the tradition of them. For me, I have a tradition in my family of sufganiyot. So you eat certain donuts on Hanukkah, or a friend of mine always bringing me these Polish donuts called pączki that you eat on Fat Tuesday. And so I had a good friend growing up from school where I'd get a bag delivered to me at lunch and it'd be this donut. And so now every Fat Tuesday, I'm going to hunt down some pączki, these like jelly-filled donuts to eat. So I think, did you find some of those sort of like strong traditions in American culture with your book?
People always embed food in general in those sort of pattern cultural practices. In Indianapolis, for instance, often one of the things I heard from people who favored longs is that they associated it with the speedway. They would go to events at the track, and one of the things you do before you go out to the track is you're heading out West 16th Street, you stop at Long's, you get donuts, you take them to the track, or vice versa, you take them back after qualifyings or whatever. And there are also lots of people that associate them with Sunday. Folks that go to church on Sunday would say, you know, now after service at 12 o'clock, we would go to the donut shop, or we would have Longs at the church afterwards.
That's the kind of church I want to go to. I want some longs.
And schools too, you know, there are plenty of schools too. You know, bands often would sell Krispy Kremes. When I was a kid, that's how we got Krispy Kremes, is bands would sell them as fundraisers.
So let's start with let's get to an origin story. How did donuts get to the US?
The clearest path really is with the Dutch. The Dutch come to what is now New York in the 17th century. Dutch cuisine is mostly about meat and cheese, actually, but they did have butter cake pastries that are part of that cuisine. And one of those was known as the oliekoek, that begins to appear in some cookbooks in the 18th century a few times. It gets mentioned in passing. What they look like at any given time is not entirely clear, but it's clearly a fried pastry. And that, in the late 18th and early 19th century, is really what becomes the genesis for the American donut. But there's fried flour, there's pastry in every cuisine on the face of the planet. Sometime in the Neolithic, somebody was boiling oil and they dropped a little bit of flour into the oil and picked it out and ate it and realized they'd hit on something. And, you know, pastry is a really nice base for both sweet and savory foods. And there are savory pastries in many places of the world. Donuts, obviously, we associate with being a sweet pastry. So we see something like that everywhere.
Gotcha. So how does this go from the transition to the United States to becoming like this symbol of nationalism for America? Because I feel like a donut feels very quintessentially American.
Well, there are plenty of donut makers that'd be really happy to hear that you associate donuts with America and the flag and nationalism,
I guess.
American identity. And they're clearly, we begin to consume donuts in America, certainly in the early 20th century, with an intensity that nobody else was on the face of the earth, although there are plenty of pastry traditions in other places. For many people in the early 21st century, when they say the donut is an American food, they're generally not being necessarily supportive of that food tradition. You know, they're often looking at it as a sign of American fast food ways rolling over the face of the planet. And donuts are very typically American in the sense that we favor high carbohydrate, high sugar diets, and we do like foods that we can eat that are inexpensive, and we like foods that we can eat relatively rapidly. and they can be mass produced. And donuts do all of those things. So they are very typical of American mass food production. And donut shops, Krispy Kreme, for instance, overseas looks just like it does in the South. Dunkin' shops look the same everywhere. The donuts taste much the same. And they've been very, very successful in lots of places outside the US.
Do you think the size, did Americans make it bigger too? I feel like we're always making things bigger.
It depends on the donut shop. You know, there are plenty of donut shops that make Frisbee-sized donuts. And then there are places that actually make dainty little yeast donuts. That's a little distinctive, actually. That's a little distinctive from one shop to the next, I think.
Well, I guess that gets me into my next question, which do donut quality and types kind of vary by region? I'm thinking like Chicago style pizza, which editorially is the best, versus New York style pizza, which I'm not as much of a fan of. Did you find that regionality come across?
I think the basic distinction in regionalisms in the States is usually North and South. And usually when people draw that line, they draw it between Dunkin' in the North and Krispy Kreme to the South. Dunkin' is a cake donut, so it's a little heavier. It spends a little more time in the oil. It has a little bit more calories. Dunkin' also has a very rich history linked to coffee. That's really where they make their money, is coffee, not donuts. And in the South, on the other hand, our favor has often been Krispy Kreme is a good example of a yeast-raised donut that is a little lower calories and is super sweet. So that's often the distinction we make in the States. In the West, but you know, you can go to places in the West certainly and eat both cake donuts and yeast donuts. And frankly, you know, Dunkin' sells both of those. Both sells cake as well as yeast donuts as well.
In your travels for the book, did you come across a donut that you were like, huh, this is different, or something real unique regionally?
Near the end of the period I was doing the research, there began to be a number of shops that emerged that are sort of designer shops. Great American Donut is kind of an example here in the city, where really skilled chefs had decided to turn their attention to making donuts. Pastry is a really flexible medium. You can do a lot with it. Dunkin' and Krispy Kreme make fabulous donuts, but they're very much mass produced. You pour powder out of a bag into a donut machine. It's relatively straightforward. You know, the ingredients are already mixed. Many of these designer donut shops, though, will make very, very distinctive donuts from day to day and experiment with the medium. Those are a little more expensive donuts. So those shops haven't always actually done as well as their chain competitors. But I think that's actually something that's not going to go away. Where there are a lot of foodies and in big communities, you're going to see those sorts of donut shops.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something I've seen. That trend of fancy donuts is new. It seems like the last 10, 15 years,
Yeah,
more than before. So when you were doing your research, did you come across interesting takes on donuts throughout the world or different cultures that kind of fit into this?
I think actually the coolest international take on donuts is in Canada, where Canada is especially Eastern Canada, has embraced Tim Hortons. You know, they take it as a sort of national brand and a piece of identity. And there are Canadians that will say donuts are truly a Canadian food, not a US food and, you know, an American food. You know, they'll say donuts are perfectly suited to very cold climates. Canada provides that. Tim Hortons also can invoke hockey culture. So Tim Horton, you know, was a hockey player. So they play on a whole lot of kind of Canadian nationalist identity kinds of issues, even though the donuts are very much like what we would find south of the border, you know, that we find here. And when Krispy Kreme decided to expand into Canada, it was like an act of war for many Canadians that, you know, we had decided these super sweet donuts would be able to compete with Tim Hortons. And in the end, actually, they didn't compete very well at all.
But I think we could probably say the same thing about Tim Hortons down south, though, right? Where
Yeah,
crispy.
Hortons has not done super well in the U.S. They tried once to open up some chains in Florida because there are Canadians who during the winter will go to Florida. That didn't work out. The places that Hortons was most successful are really places in the U.S. that are a lot like Canada. So Cleveland, all those cities around the Great Lakes, Buffalo, those kinds of places that are very much like Canada. That's where Hortons has done actually the best.
I like that they've got their people in their region. Um, so why are donuts a breakfast food?
That's partly an artifact of commuter culture. In streetcar commuting, which begins in the early 20th century, donut shops begin to emerge on those streetcar routes. Typically around World War I in the early 1920s, you begin to see some of the very earliest donut shops. Some of those will eventually become chains, like Mayflower, for instance, will come out of that culture. And eventually, we'll see chains like Dunkin' and Krispy Kreme, which emerge a little bit later, and they'll play to car culture in the morning. So, for instance, Long's is a good example of one of those sorts of venues. Long's was built in 1955. And as you drive into town on West 16th Street, when you drive in, you're literally on the south side of 16th Street. So you're on the same side of the road as Long's. So you can pull right in, you get a donut, you can pull right out. It's a relatively straightforward process. And then you drive on to work. It's very much a commuter food. It's pretty easy to eat donuts. The guy who started Dunkin', he had begun as a kind of coffee salesman. He had sold food off of a truck, and he realized very early that one of the most important things about donut shops is that you had to have parking for commuters. So he did things like measure the space, things that retailers do all the time now. And he understood you had to get people in relatively rapidly. And he hit on that idea of drive-throughs very, very early on.
So does donut culture kind of explode once car culture becomes a thing? Because we have donuts before car culture, correct?
We have donuts before car culture, certainly, but chains and car culture were wed to each other. You really couldn't have had the growth of donut chains without car culture. It would have been a very different animal. There are donut shops in the late 19th and early 20th century, and you can make donuts at home. But, for those of you who, if you've ever made donuts at home, oil is a very messy medium. It's a mess in your kitchen. Flour is a little unpredictable. Baking actually takes a lot of decision making. On the other hand, I can drive to a Jack's and get a dozen for not very much, a whole lot quicker, frankly. So there's always been a tendency for donuts to mostly be purchased at donut shops rather than be made at home.
Gotcha. So donuts have this really strong connection to World War I and World War II. So can you talk a little bit about what role they played and sort of what that legacy looked like?
Well, the history of donuts in World War I was that Salvation Army served soldiers on the front during the war. So they were very close to the front. And one of the things that the women that worked for the Salvation Army believed is that one of the ways you would support soldiers is by providing food that would remind them of home. And these women that were in charge of cooking, like these gals here in this image, they realized that one of the things that soldiers were attracted to is foods with strong smell. So they tried to make pies first. And they realized this was just not practical. You needed an oven. It's difficult to make some pies actually when you have a very well set up kitchen, much less on the front during war. But on the other hand, donuts were actually pretty straightforward, not as difficult to make. And donuts have a lot of sensory appeal. When donuts are being cooked, you can really smell them for a long way. And ever since then, the Salvation Army has continued to provide donuts to soldiers in war zones. They do that even today in the 21st century. They do that during World War II. They provide donuts. They've always looked at donuts as being a sort of symbol of home.
Gotcha. So it brings back into that American like idea, right? That donuts are American. They're like, well,
yeah, I think
in
for
that,
exactly, and I think for the Salvation Army, it was mostly about home more than anything else. And they did look at home as being, in many soldiers' imagination, as also being, back in the States.
we had a question in the chat that I'll ask because it's about this Red Cross and Salvation Army. Someone wanted to know if the donut slinging girls really fried donuts in soldiers' helmets. Did you ever run into that?
I've never heard they fried them in soldiers' helmets. And we do have photographs like that stereo view you showed a second ago. I mean, we have images of women during World War I preparing donuts in, behind the front, not far from the front. And those look like pretty straightforward vats of heated oil.
I will say, just as a tip, they always, on Donut Day, which is usually connected to the Salvation Army, they give away free donuts in different places around the country. So I do love a good, the summer, sometimes we even walk to the circle and get some donuts and learn about it. So it's still happening today. So in your book, you talk about how donuts have permeated a ton of different facets of life. But one thing that surprised us when we were reading it was that it goes into religion. So can you talk about how connections between faith and donuts?
Yeah, well, actually, you think about it, a religious experience is a bonding experience with a community of believers. And one of the ways that we bond, both inside and outside of houses of faith, is over food. So it's not at all unusual in the tradition I grew up with. After church, you had a huge meal, actually the heaviest meal of the week. And that always included some special kind of treat foods, and donuts were always high on that list. This is not universal to all faith traditions, but certainly many. Southern Baptists, it had, to a certain extent, it almost become a health problem at a certain point. You eat so much food after church on Sunday. So it's not really surprising, that after a faith experience, which is one of the most profound and most profoundly consequential dimensions of our experience, that we would bond over food with other believers.
Which makes sense. I just never connected really donuts to that. So I guess my faith traditions might look a little different. But then again, in my faith tradition, we have a donut worked into a holiday. So
Exactly.
are there other, have you found other traditions of donuts worked in that way? Like it's the food you eat for a specific day of the year or time of the year?
Yeah, well, the sufganiyot, that's a very typical example of that. There are also some Eastern European examples of that you eat on particular religious holidays, or Fat Tuesday, for instance. So you see that in a handful of cultures. In the States, we don't really necessarily, most of us don't associate it with a particular holiday, but I'm sure we could find any number of families who are listening will say, yes, we ate donuts on Thanksgiving or or Christmas or a certain holiday or Easter or something like that may be distinct to them.
I'm trying to think of what a Thanksgiving donut would be. I'm just imagining a Thanksgiving donut, and it's it would involve, I think, cranberry sauce, but also gravy, which is an interesting combination, I think. So donuts are very clearly in our pop culture. What pop culture narrative of police being connected to donuts, how did that get started?
Well, that actually probably is a little bit based in fact. The thing about making donuts, if you're going to have donuts that are ready when commuters are beginning to move in that kind of 6:30 to 8 o'clock hour, then you need to be up and baking at basically 2 in the morning or 1 o'clock in the morning. So you have to get up super early. So many donut shops actually really, many bakeries in urban areas especially don't close. They'll go 24 hours. But even if they do close, you get up generally very early. So the argument has always been that, you know, for police who are looking for a place to stop when they're on the beat or to have a cup of coffee or to get something to eat, donut shops are actually fun, you know, practically make a lot of sense. There are donut shop owners who will also argue that it's a good thing to have a police officer in the restaurant at any given time. You know, that it just seems to be, it makes the place seem safer. Some people feel more comfortable. So that's probably based on a little bit of functional reality, even though it's hyperbolized when it enters popular culture.
Were there other pop culture references that you found striking as you were kind of digging into it?
Well, donuts are certainly appear in popular culture quite a lot, but I think the popular culture references begin and end with Homer Simpson. Homer is kind of the perfect articulation of bodily desire, and Homer wrestles with all of the kind of bodily desires most of us do. Donuts are delicious, yet for many of us, we feel a bit of tension about eating a whole lot of donuts. So we have that kind of fight with our body. Homer sort of gives into that fight. You know, he embraces desire, but of course he's a cartoon and he can do that. For the rest of us, they're real cardiac and health issues. So it's a much more, you know, it's a much more problematic fight for many of us. But I think The Simpsons actually captures much of that in a really interesting kind of way.
Do you see that kind of reminds me of like health crazes. So do we see donuts villainized in sort of popular culture as we diet around them?
Oh, sure, of course. People constantly will pick on donuts as an example of an unhealthy food. Men's Health used to rank the health of American cities, and one of the ways they would rank you as an unhealthy city would be by counting the number of donut shops per capita. So if you had more donut shops, you were an unhealthy place. So it was often looked at as a kind of unusual example of unhealthiness. The reality is, you know, a glazed donut is typically about 300, 400 calories, depending on where we eat it. There are plenty of coffee concoctions at Starbucks that have 800 to 1100 calories in them when you add cream and caramel that are much more unhealthy, but somehow they skate under the radar. Donuts often get, I think, a somewhat bad rap. You know, they end up getting picked out as a quote unquote unhealthy food. And certainly if all you eat is donuts, this will be problematic. Nevertheless, they're often used as an example, and we don't look at all the other pieces of our diet that really are equally or perhaps even much more problematic.
So I'm gonna ask you one more question and we're gonna transition to the Q&A. So if people do have other questions, feel free to drop them into the question and answer or the chat. But one that's already come up in the Q&A, which we had on our list, was why do donuts have holes, and what is the start of a donut hole being sold as a donut hole?
Yeah, the latter, I don't know the answer to. Horton's has always sold those donut holes, those Timbits, and actually they're very, very popular. I had never seen that actually when I was a kid, for instance. I'd never heard of that. Where the hole comes from in the donut is not exactly well documented. There are American cookbooks that provide recipes for donuts as early as 1803. That's probably the first documented recipe for a donut, but none of them talk about the torus shape that with a hole that we associate with a donut today, really until about the Civil War in the mid-19th century is the first time we see that. And many chefs assume, and I think this is probably true, that the reason you have a hole in a donut partly is to form the donut itself, but also for the evenness of cooking, you know, when it goes through the oil bath. That way you won't end up with that kind of doughy center that doesn't get as much oil saturation and doesn't get the same heat as the exterior of the donut. I think there are stories that were spun out in the 20th century by advertisers about where the donut hole emerged. They were created to place on the wheels of ships as they were being steered across the ocean, and those sound pretty cool. But in this case, the kind of functional answer probably is right. Sometimes when you hear hoofbeats, it's much more likely to be horses than zebras. And in this case, that's probably the case. This is probably just a functional response from chefs.
Gotcha. I always wondered where the donut hole came from. So that's good to know. Is there a side to, I'm not used to donuts being as filled with cream as custard. So does that tradition also kind of do you know if when that comes about?
I don't know, actually. Their filled donuts begin, most of that kind of frosted donut and the what is often referred to as the variety donut is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. We don't really begin to see those until about the 1950s. However, that being said, there are eclairs or something like an eclair, a filled pastry in the late Middle Ages. You know, French pastry chefs made something that you and I might call an eclair that were filled with a variety of creams. So the phenomenon of filling donuts with sweet concoction is not at all a new thing.
Gotcha. So one question we have in the Q&A is the correct spelling donut or with an O-N-U-T or with the U, D-O-U-G-H?
The answer is yes.
Yes, they're both
Either
right.
one of them is correct. You don't see the short D-O-N-U-T spelling. You don't really begin to see that actually until about World War II. There is an argument by some folks that I can't substantiate that actually sign makers wanted to use the D-O-N-U-T because it makes for a shorter sign. There may be some truth to that, especially if you're producing neon and being charged, by the linear inch by letter. But we don't really see that until 20th century. The 19th century spelling is usually donut, and it's often in the first half of the 19th century, it's spelled as two words. It's spelled as dough space N-U-T. You don't see that as a single word really until the second half of the 19th century.
Huh. I know I was debating as to which way to spell it as we were working on this program. And I think
They're
I
both
kept
right.
going between the two. So both are right. Is that what Webster's tells us are both right?
I don't know what Webster's tells us actually, and I'm sure the OED has a long entry that will tell you where they see as the first uses of all of those spellings.
I will say I looked it up in AP style does the O-U-G-H-T, so we kind of rolled with that. Another question from the chat that came in is that why are donuts sold by the dozen? Is there a reason?
I don't know the answer to that actually. I'm not entirely sure I know the answer to that. I don't have a good response to that. There's some good donut historian. There's some baker out there who could tell us how baker's dozens begin, because we begin to see that certainly early in the 20th century.
Yeah, and then I like that you get an extra one on top just need an extra one. So I know that I'm pretty sure this image is in your book, but someone had a question about the image that I shared at the very beginning we'll go back. There we go. Of this girl with the bear. That was in your book, right?
Yes, it was.
Do you know the story behind it?
The postcard itself, I don't really know the story. I think that really is just meant to be a cute image. In the context of the book, one of the reasons I use this image is that bear hunters have often argued that the single food that's most likely to attract bears is donuts. So they'll use, they do what's called bear baiting. So you can pay to go on a hunting trip, for instance, to bring down bears. And one of the ways bears will be baited is by leaving Krispy Kremes out in the woods.
Huh.
That don't, bears have very, very strong sense of smell. So they're very likely to go after these kind of, these strong sensory foods like donuts.
I will say, for those of you that were curious, there are a couple other photos of this girl and different photo shoots on the Library of Congress.
Okay.
So I'm fairly certain, well, that and the chain around the bear's neck, that it was some sort of promotional, video. But I thought he was cute. She was cute. So I like to include it. We did have a question about Red Skelton, which I know isn't actually in Paul's book, but as a employee at the Indiana Historical Society, I think we all in some ways have the duty to be a Red Skelton expert. We have an amazing collection of Red Skelton materials, and there's also a lot down in Evansville where he was from. If you don't know, Red Skelton was a comic and had a radio show and a TV show. He did his pieces because he owned all of his material. It didn't go into syndication like others, but he was, I would say, as popular as the Three Stooges in his time, and that same transition between radio and TV. And one of his most famous pantomime sketches that got him known around the world was the Donut Dunkers. And later his radio show was sponsored by Fleshman's Yeast Hour. So a lot of times when you see Red Skelton dunking the donut into coffee, that comes from that sketch. If you were curious about Red Skelton. If you want to learn more and you're a member of the Indiana Historical Society, we do a donut club once a month on a Friday morning. And I know I'm pretty sure there's one coming up about Red Skelton and donuts. So check that out. But that's my little plug for Red Skelton, not to put Paul on the spot about Red Skelton.
That's a better answer than I had.
Oh, sorry. This Red Skelton's from Vincennes. Thank you, Mark. I got that. Yeah. I missed that one up. Lots of people. Barbara also. Barbara is one of our trusty librarians. So thank you, guys. I misspoke. So I think I don't have very many more questions in the chat. But was there something else that, as you were doing your research, this book kind of surprised you as you were going along?
I don't know if it was anything that necessarily surprised me, but I'm always continually impressed by the depth of devotion people have to particular donut shops. It becomes it's an article of faith. And I was really, that had been one of the reasons I'd chosen donuts as sort of a topic. And that probably was, I was right from the beginning that people would have very strong feelings. So it made for a kind of interesting material analysis in that respect. There's always something. And regularly somebody will give me, have a long lecture with me about a particular donut shop, or they tell me about a place I've never heard of or never been, actually. And there are plenty, even in central Indiana, there's plenty of donut shops I've never been to. And there's always somebody out there who's willing to stand up for them and preach the faith.
I was going to say, we were chatting before we got started, and I feel like we all had very strong opinions on where we want to get our donuts and where our favorites are. So I feel like that holds true today.
Yeah, well, I think actually the thing that's interesting is it's not just that we're committed to a particular donut shop, but for many people, when they begin to talk about donuts, words fail them. It's like it's the boundaries of the limits of language. Describe to somebody your favorite food. Words really don't carry that off. It's very much a corporeal experience. And for many people, donuts are like that, and their own shop is like that. So finally, what will happen if somebody's trying to sell you on their donut shop? They'll take you there. Well, you have to go. You'll love Lawns. I'll take you there right now. That's a rate, you know, because words fail. You have to have a physical experience, and someone else has to have that physical experience.
Yeah, I feel like when I was in grad school, we were putting together a walking tour and we were talking about religious spaces in Indianapolis. And we made a strong argument for Hinkle Fieldhouse going on that list because people have this almost religiosity around basketball here, which was something new for me as an outsider coming to live here. And I feel like the way you describe a donut is the same way. It's like, you have certain places where you're like, it's just a magical experience to eat it and you have to have it. So I kind of get that. I don't think it's just a Hoosier thing.
Oh,
But
not
we
at all. No,
definitely,
it's a, you know, for many people, their favorite donut shop is a sort of temple or their chain. I mean, it's very much an article of faith.
do you have any sense of which state is the top donut consuming state? Courtney, who wrote in, said that when she lived in Maine, there was a Dunkin' Donuts on every corner. So she didn't know if that was something about the Northeast or.
That's true of most of the Northeast. And actually, when you go to Boston, there is a Dunkin' on every corner. That's what most of Massachusetts looks like as well, in the rest of New England. Per capita, the most donut shops in the United States are in Southern California. If you want to go to the hotbed for American donuts in the United States, you go to LA. If you want it, the only place in the world that can compete with the number of donut shops in LA is actually around Toronto and in Hamilton, Ontario, where Hortons is based.
And are those chains or are those like local craft shops, or is it just all of them all in one place?
In LA, it's a little bit of both. There is a tradition of Southeast Asian immigrants who run donut shops because donut shops have a tendency to be relatively inexpensive to set up. You don't need a ton of equipment. You have a relatively modest space. Once you have a flour supply and the basic equipment, you know, the overhead is not that much. And if you came with your family, you will use them as a labor source. So it's often a kind of for many entrepreneurs, it begins to be a way they enter business. But there are also chains on the landscape in Southern California as well. Some West Coast chains that we don't see here, but also some chains that you and I would recognize.
Is that small outside of the chains? I'm seeing a trend of like family owned donut shops. That's something we see in Long's, but also Jack's here, you know, 3 generations making donuts. So is that something that you saw a lot of this tradition of family owned bakeries that just continue?
Yeah, we see family, that kind of mom and pop, if you will, bakery is very typical throughout the country. You know, we have a tendency to see families working in shops. Donut shops are not really a way to become rich. So if you have your family working in the shop at you know, perhaps not at a rate you might pay a large workforce, then you have a chance to perhaps produce a little bit more profit. So there's a tendency for shops to actually stay in the family. Long's has stayed in a family for quite a while. That's not at all unusual.
We've seen a lot of weddings have donut bars now. Have you seen a change in how we're consuming donuts today, or sort of this transition to evening donuts or fancy
Yeah,
donuts?
Krispy Kreme will come to your wedding if you're in the right region. They'll bring their little red and white panel van that comes there, and they'll give donuts to you perhaps on the way to after the ceremony, on the way to the reception. You know, you've been through the wedding already. It took a while. You stood there a long time before the wedding. Then you're going to wait a while before you have food at the reception. So you can get donuts in between. And you also can do a wedding cake, a donut wedding cake. And if you call Krispy Kreme, you know, they have somebody who will tell you how to stack donuts. You know, they'll tell you how to stack a wedding cake and how to put, because it's just regular donuts. Just buy dozens of donuts and stack them together.
And it's probably a little cheaper than buying a tiered cake, right?
Oh, of course, anybody's
Of
bought a
course.
wedding cake knows that.
I mean, I like the idea of having a good donut cake at a future wedding, maybe, hypothetically. We'll see.
Of course.
Uh, I keep seeing the donut walls appear on Pinterest, and I feel like it's that same way of make your own donut wall, and then you hang your donuts, and your friends can go eat them. Um, just sort of a fun way to do it. Um, I think we've wrapped up sort of what's in our Q&A and our questions. So is there something that we didn't get to talk about that was something that really struck you as you were writing the book?
No, I think probably the thing I would want people to walk away from is, as a researcher, I don't try to talk people out of their feelings. If somebody feels that the best donut shop in town is Jack's, then I'm just kind of interested in how they feel that way, and how did a donut shop assume the importance and consequence in their lives that it did. And if they're anti-donut, and that does include lots and lots of people, I'm kind of interested in how they came to see donuts as being so unhealthy, and what does that tell us really about how they see their own bodies? How do they see body discipline in a way that perhaps those of us standing in line at Long's in the morning may construct a little bit differently? When I'm in line at Jack's in the morning, I've overcome that probably, or I've negotiated it somehow. Or I've told myself, later on today, I'll go for a long jog. I'll burn those calories. How do we do those negotiations? Those are the kind of stories I think that food historians, food scholars are really interested in.
What inspired, what inspired you to write this book? We said it was a summer project, but how did you get into it?
Actually, the editor at the press had talked to me. He knew I did contemporary material culture. And he said, we're interested in doing a book on donuts. And there are lots of food histories. There's a great book on salt, for instance. There's a book on cod. So there's all these really cool food history books. And he said, we're interested in doing one on donuts. What do you think? Do you think people would read that? And I said, well, of course they would. Donuts are actually really fascinating. And here's all the things you would have to do methodologically. Here's how you'd frame it. This is what it would look like. And he sent me back an email and said, well, you're interested. And my son decided this was a fabulous project. My kid was 10 and he decided, we're going to go on this research project. Instead of going to a really hot archaeological site for a summer, we're going to drive around to donut shops all summer and eat donuts and visit people and talk to them about pastry. And he thought that was a fabulous project. So it actually worked, and I kind of thought that would be a kind of interesting break from the sort of work I had done.
So what's next for you? This book's been out for a little bit. What's your next project that you're working on?
I have a book coming out in December called Revolting Things. It's on unpleasant material culture. So the donut book is about pleasant material culture, and the book I have coming out at the end of the year is about really unpleasant sorts of material culture. So Confederate memorials, for example, urban renewal landscapes. Those are the landscapes of racist violence. Those are the kinds of things I'm interested in that book. So it's in some ways, it's a kind of interesting inverse of the donut book, but it looks at a bunch of different material culture and not just one thing.
Oh, cool. I didn't know if revolting meant you were going like to garbage from donuts, but that fits with.
I think actually the revolting for me was much like the donuts. For the people that love donuts, they have difficulty expressing how much they adore and love donuts. And there's some material culture that we find so unpleasant, we can't find a way to talk about it. Lynching landscapes, for instance, are like that. Confederate monuments are often like that. Many of the landscapes of the Holocaust are like that. They're very difficult for us to articulate. They're really tough to speak. So in many ways, they're a lot like donuts in that respect. They just are at a very different end of the spectrum.
Hmm. I like that. I like that thought to kind of end on, thinking about sort of those two sides of it. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for speaking with us today and talking to us about donuts. We really appreciate it. I'm going to throw it back over to Brianna to wrap us up.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thanks again to Callie and Paul for carrying this interesting and delicious conversation. Next week, we're back at it with some more history happy hours. So join us when we talk about Asian activism from the 1960s to today on July 30th. Keep an eye out for some more of our history happy hours on the Equal Rights Amendment, suffrage, underwear, and more. Same time, same place, new Zoom link. We also have some other exciting virtual programs coming soon, such as Preserving Your Family Recipes Workshop this Saturday and the Style, Flair, and Care of Black Hair webinar in August. Sign up for all of our history happy hours and all our other amazing virtual offerings at indianahistory.org. If you missed your chance to donate or you would like to make a further gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, please visit indianahistory.org/virtual-resources/donate. Your donation will allow us to continue to share Hoosier stories. You'll get an email from us tomorrow morning with all of these links that we have provided during today's program and a survey included. The survey will take 1 minute, and we'd love to know what you thought and how we can make programs like this better. We'll post this conversation to the IHS YouTube channel in the upcoming weeks. Thank you, guys. Stay safe and healthy. Maybe go pick up a donut from your favorite donut shop, and we can't wait to see you in the future.